The Hoodsbrough Hostilities, Part 4. The Strong Arm of the Law. Park keeping is not traditionally regarded as a lucrative career, but Joe Rando had shown how it could be made to pay. Tree Surgeon Trevor had shared in some of those profits, and he was reluctant to forego that income stream. Park keeping is not traditionally regarded as a job that brings high social status, but following the rumble at the railway hotel, Tree Surgeon Trevor found that he was being treated with unaccustomed deference, particularly if his chainsaw was at hand, and he was reluctant to forego this new one respect. Joe Rando might be dead, but he saw no reason not to continue where she had left off, and his employees at the park were happy to follow along. And so Joe Rando's boys remained in business. They commemorated her memory by commissioning a plaque bearing her name and dates, which they affixed to one of the park benches. The landlord of the railway hotel could no longer source duty-free whisky from the spaghetti mob. He was having to purchase his spirits at full price from regulated suppliers. He decided to compensate for his reduced margins by increasing turnover. He needed something to bring the punters in. And so Joe Rando's boys relocated their retail business from the car park at the railway hotel into the back bar, where they could be found most afternoons. Now, if Joe Rando's boys had behaved themselves, this might all have passed under the radar, but they did not behave themselves. Instead, they mixed business with pleasure and imbibed freely during working hours. And then, after they had concluded their sales for the day, they would hang around the neighbourhood, acting in a most unruly manner. The local residents did not take kindly to this, with the result that multiple complaints were made to the Hoodsbrough police. The chief of the Hoodsbrough police at this time was one Captain O'Carroll. He was a placid man who was content to leave the criminal classes to pursue their chosen careers as long as they kept themselves to themselves, did not cause a commotion, and made a handsome annual donation to the Police Benevolent Fund, of which he was the treasurer and main beneficiary. But his good nature only went so far, and Joe Rando's boys were pushing him to his limits. After all, he had his professional pride and standing in the local community to think of. He decided that some high-profile policing was required to reassure the public. Accordingly, one afternoon he assembled a police patrol, which he led in person, through Hoodsbrough town centre, toward the railway hotel. On that particular day, Tree Surgeon Trevor had arrived at the railway hotel at noon. He was accompanied by Punchy Pete and Ernie the Ox, who had emerged from his hospital bed to find that Bella Salmonella was in Switzerland, and Big Bruno had gone out of business. Ernie had therefore to seek new employment, and Trevor had hired him to provide additional muscle. By mid-afternoon, all three of them were extremely well oiled. They staggered out of the railway hotel, staggered across the road, and staggered into the local corner shop. Trevor walked up to the counter, on which he placed his chainsaw. He then enquired of the shopkeeper if he had any licorice. The shopkeeper replied in the affirmative, and asked Trevor how much he would like. Trevor replied that he would not like any, as licorice tasted disgusting. Punchy Pete laughed at this witty badinage. Meanwhile, Ernie the Ox helped himself to a copy of the Beano from the magazine rack. The police patrol was now approaching the railway hotel. At the front marched Captain O'Carroll, nervously clutching an automatic pistol, and Sergeant Smith, armed with the traditional truncheon. Behind them came Constable Daly, also carrying a truncheon, and Constable Murphy, who was carrying a rifle. This was not standard police equipment, but Constable Murphy had found it in the lost property store and decided to put it to good use. After all, if he had to fight with a chainsaw-wielding killer, he preferred to do so from a healthy distance. Joe Rando's boys staggered out of the corner shop and stood swaying on the pavement, laughing and blinking in the sunlight. The police patrol had now reached the railway hotel. All seemed quiet. Sergeant Smith proceeded to the end of the road. On reaching it, he observed Joe Rando's boys loitering with intent on the far side of the street. He blew his whistle to summon his colleagues to his assistance. Constable Murphy moved up to join him, but Captain O'Carroll and Constable Daly seemed less keen to get involved. By contrast, on the opposite side of the street, it appears that Joe Rando's boys welcomed an opportunity to mix it. Tree Surgeon Trevor fired up his chainsaw and charged towards Sergeant Smith, closely followed by Ernie the Ox. But Trevor and Ernie's initial enthusiasm was cooled when Constable Murphy ostentatiously drew back the bolt on his rifle, causing them both to abruptly halt their forward progress. Not so Punchy Pete. Even as Trevor and Ernie's advance stalled, Pete sprinted past the two of them. Before Constable Murphy could so much as raise his rifle, Pete was on him, arms swinging. A right hook connected with Constable Murphy's head, causing him to reel backwards. But Pete's moment of triumph was short-lived. Sergeant Smith stepped forward and swung his truncheon, and now it was Punchy Pete's turn to reel back. Constable Murphy took the opportunity to run around the corner and put some distance between himself and Joe Rando's boys. He raised his rifle, and there was a sharp crack. But he was still a bit shaky after receiving a fist to the face. His aim was awry, and the bullet hissed harmlessly past Tree Surgeon Trevor's ear. Meanwhile, Sergeant Smith had unfinished business with Punchy Pete. He pursued the still dazed pugilist and employed his truncheon for a second time, knocking Pete cold. It seemed that Sergeant Smith's success emboldened Captain O'Carroll, who chose this moment to move up and join the fray. He fired his automatic pistol at Tree Surgeon Trevor, but the standard of police marksmanship on display that day was lamentably poor. The bullet missed its mark. Maybe Ernie the Ox thought that Captain O'Carroll had been firing at him. Whatever the reason, he took a sudden dislike to the police chief. Ernie raised his trusty cudgel, ran up to Captain O'Carroll, and swung it in a wide downward arc. His intention had been to strike Captain O'Carroll full on the head. As it was, Captain O'Carroll managed to move his head aside, so that the blow struck him on the shoulder. Sergeant Smith took exception to seeing his chief thus mishandled. He strode over to Ernie the Ox. Once more the sergeant's trusty truncheon was utilised to good effect. Ernie was stretched senseless in the middle of the road. Tree Surgeon Trevor had seen enough. As Constable Murphy took yet another ineffective pot shot at him, Trevor turned and fled. Captain O'Carroll had done his duty. The Hoodsbrough police had restored law and order to the environs of the railway hotel.